All right, in this video, we're going to continue working on the handoff between our master server and our region servers. So where I'm going to start is I want to allow our clients to securely authenticate with our game servers so our game servers know when a client joins which user he is in that game. And I'm going to do that by adding a token to our database table that contains the information about a player being in a game. So it'll be a randomly generated token. The token will be sent from the master server to each individual game clients, and then the clients, once they connect to a region server, will send that token to the server, and then that will allow them to authenticate. So to start this off, we're going to go into our data project in our entities, and then our user and game, and I'm going to add in a token here. It's going to be very similar to our client authentication token. I guess I could also add in the request IP as well as the token. So I'm just going to copy these two fields here and paste them down here. So now we have two more required string fields, both max length of 64 for both of our token and our request IP. So we can validate both of those things. Now, because we modified the user and game entity, we have to generate a migration. I did actually, in the entities that we created in the last video, I did forget to add the required field to a variety of things. And let's go ahead and add that. Let's go ahead and add that constraint in here. So I'm going to add required to hero, team, has abandoned will be required, game will be required, and player will be required. And I'll also make the change to, what was the other one that we did? Our game server entity. Our name will be required, and our created at will be required. And that just sets them to not null in the database. And then also in our game entity, we'll do level name. Don't need to put a required here on this hash set. We do need a required there, and then a required there. Obviously, we do not need a required on destroyed at because it's supposed to be a nullable field. So I just added that. We might as well add those in when we create our migration. So in our package manager console, make sure that the default application is BuzzMMO Web or any project that has a connection string on it. And then make sure that our default project on this is going to be buzzmmo.data, and then I'll do add migration, and then added token to user in game. And go ahead and hit enter, and that'll generate our migration for our database. So give it a second there. Now we might run into an issue. So let's see, drops the foreign keys, adds indexes, adds columns, and sets the nullable to false. So yeah, that's fine. That's all good. We might run into an issue though when we come here and type in update database to apply this new migration. It might throw an error because the added fields and the added fields being required. So let's just try it now, and I think it's going to fail. I think we're going to have to nuke the data in that table, but we'll see. Just give it a second there. Update database. Make sure to spell that right. For the third time. And user in games does not exist. That's weird. So I'm going to add the verbose flag to see. Actually, I think I know exactly what's going on. The blah, blah, blah doesn't exist often happens when it tries to do something that... well, no, it says user in game, drop foreign key. Oh, because it has this DBO dot on it. Yeah, that's going to be a problem. So DBO would be something that you would use in... Oh, what am I doing? It'd be something that you would use in MS SQL, but not something that you would use in in MySQL. So go ahead and just nuke all those DBO references, and then we can try that again. And I'll specify the verbose flag just to, in case it errors out again, we'll know exactly on what line it errored out on. And as you can see, it actually went ahead and worked. So I should be able to open up my database right now over here and jump over into user and games and say alter table, and we should have this token and request IP, and both of them are set to not null. And looks like both of them are just being defaulted to empty strings for the existing game IDs that were added. But with that in place, what we can do now is we can generate a random token for our games. So I think what I'm going to do is, remember in the last video I was talking about how in my game server context, how I'm not so happy that I'm accessing the database here and doing all this databasey things in this particular piece of code. And I think what I'm going to do actually is something similar to what we did before with our client authentication token service and our MMO setting service. And that is create a service in the BuzzMMO data project that will be able to add all these things in here. So as you see, it just takes in an MMO database context as a parameter and blah, blah, blah. So over here in services, I'm going to create a new service, and it's going to be called Game Entity Service, I guess, would be a fine name for that, I suppose. And Game Entity Service, I'm going to, let's full screen this so I get some more space here and move that out of the way. I want to take the code that we have right here and move it into here, so that we have this this service. And in the future, we can replace the implementation of this if we change our database access layer or whatever. So just trying to keep things that touch the database kind of over here in this database project. And I know I am touching the database in a couple other places, and we can slowly move the instances where we do touch the database back into this project where I think it belongs. But anyway, so for the game entity service, we'll do MMO database context database. And we need a couple methods here. The first method is, obviously, we need to be able to create a game entity. So as you see here, we create a game entity based off of a game parameters, and it returns a game entity object. So we should be able to do public game entity create game, and this should take in a game parameters. And now parameters should contain everything that we need in order to start the game. Unfortunately, it does not contain the level name. So that's an interesting thing right here. So our level name, we haven't really discussed how it's going to decide which level to start. The way I'm kind of imagining it is that our game parameters will specify, either specify a specific level to start on or specify like random or something like that. And that choice as far as which level it should be, I guess it could go into this method, now that I'm thinking about it. Or should I have that logic be in this method? I mean, we could say that the create game method is going to be responsible for creating a game entity, filling out the parameters based off of what parameters were set by the person in the lobby who started the game. And so if we added an option, like which level do you want? Do you want a specific level? Do you want a random level? Blah, blah, blah. That will be put into this game parameters. And then the choice as to which level to actually start, I suppose, can be here in this method. So more or less, I'm just going to take all this code that we already have written over here, and I'm just going to take it and cut it, come over here to create game and paste it right there. So obviously we have a couple things that we need to change. First of all, we need to using system at the top. Second, database is now underscore database. And same with right here. Now we do have an interesting thing here. So as far as which game server to make this game entity, that should definitely be something that's passed into a parameter to create game. So we should have a unique ID. We should have a GUID server ID right there. Pass that in as a parameter. And that's all done there. And then, of course, down here at the bottom, we're going to have to do database.games.add game entity, and then return game entity. Oh, of course, we do database.save changes to complete that little unit of work there. So before I go in and actually add the code that's responsible for generating the tokens, let's hop back over here and fix our game server context so that it uses the game entity service instead. So let's see here. So we're going to need to wire game entity service into our IRC container as well as the MMO database context. Now that brings in an interesting point here as far as sharing the MMO database context. Generally speaking, in Entity Framework, it's kind of expected that you create a new context. In a website, it's really simple. Every request gets a new instantiation of context. It will handle pooling the database connections for you and all that fun stuff. In a WPF app or a Win Forms app, it's generally, I think that the main recommendation is to have one database context per screen or one database context per unit of work. You don't want to have a database context kind of laying around all the time. So to fix that, or to handle that, I think the way I'm going to do this is going to be interesting. So if you want to take a look at, we'll be coming back to the game entity service pretty soon here, but here's just a quick scroll through of that. Now let's go ahead and close that. Let's go ahead and configure AutoFac to work with our game entity service. So I'm going to come here down to our, actually we already are here, in our game server context. So what I can do here is in our configure method, when we configure our container, I'm going to say builder register type. I'm going to register a, I'm going to go ahead and register an MMO database, context as itself, and I'm going to say instance per dependency. So every time we request an MMO database context, we get a new copy. Then I'm going to do builder register type game entity service as self, and I'll also instance per dependency. Then down here, we now no longer need to instantiate the database MMO database context. Instead, we're going to do var service equals container dot resolve game entity service, and then I'm going to say var game entity equals service dot create game, passing in our config dot game server dot unique ID as the server ID, as well as our parameters for our parameters. And then I'm just going to nuke that using statement. So what we're left with is simply instantiating the service, which instantiates an MMO database context, creating the game entity, and then returning a new game instance. So in the future, we'll create our actual object, our actual class that represents a running simulation, and then we'll pass in maybe just the game entity ID into that. I don't know. We'll figure that out when we get to it, because what I wanted to do here, at least right now in this video, is I want to come back to the create game method, and I want to create a token. So yeah, so jumping back into our data project, we already created a token in client authentication token service. We simply create a token here. So the question is do we copy and paste this code, or do we abstract this away? I think I'm just going to copy and paste this code for right now. If we find that we're creating more tokens elsewhere, we can maybe create a secure token generator service or an extension method or something like that. But I think right now, since we're only using it in 2 instances, I'm going to copy and paste it. So coming back over into the game entity service, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a method here. I'm going to say, oh, that's interesting. We don't have the ID from our player, or our IP from our player details. I might, we won't worry about that right now. Instead, we'll just generate our tokens, and we won't worry about filling out the IPs just yet. So I'm going to create a private string generate client token, and then I'm going to paste this in here, and I'm simply going to, instead of saying token.token equals, I'll just say return. So, or that involves instantiating an RNG crypto provider a bunch of times. I'm actually not going to separate this out into a method. Oh wait, I'm in the client authentication service. Oops, I did not want to do that. I want to copy that, come back to the game entity service, and I'm going to paste this right here. I'm going to import in, that's going to bring in security cryptography. And then I'm going to take this for each loop, and I'm going to paste that right there. And then I'm going to grab that, move that down, and say token equals that. So now we're just creating one instantiation of the RNG crypto service provider, and oh, we should also pull this into the loop. So obviously, so every player doesn't get the same token. So this way, we now have a token for each one of the players, and we're not passing that back in the game instance. I'm going to actually have the server, the master server, actually reconnect to the database and get the game entity, and then get all the users and games from the database, because there's no reason to repeat all that information. Anyway, so that's our create game. So now when we create a game, each player gets a unique token. So with that out of the way, what we can do now is we can jump into the BuzzMMO server master and jump into our game lobby system and kind of follow the code through. So in our game lobby system, when we create a game, we do lobby begin game. And then right here, we do game servers.begin game. We don't care what happens behind the scenes here, obviously, because that's going to involve sending the request to the region server doing all its fun stuff and coming back. But on our on success, we need to inform each individual player of each individual token. So that means that we can no longer do proxy.onGameStarted, because remember, proxy is a proxy that broadcasts every single message to every single client. So what we need to do here is on the on success, we need to open this up a little bit. We need to establish a connection to the database. We need to find all the users in the games. We need to match them up with the users that we have, and then send each individual user their own token. So, while informing them that the game has started. So, on success, I do want to do... Actually, I'm going to remove that. We're no longer going to have a separate on success. We're going to do that in the then here. We're going to say return fiber and queue deferred. And then we're going to open this up to be multi-line. And then in here, now we are synchronized again. So remember, when we do game servers.begin game and then have our on fail and our thens, the on fail callback and the then callback and the on success callbacks, they're not necessarily going to be executing on the same fiber as the code was ahead of it. So we have to re-enter the fiber on our thens or on our on failed. So that's what we do here. So what we're going to do here is we need to inform each individual player of their token and so on. So let's open up a database connection. I'm not happy about this much indentation, to be honest. Yeah, I'm really not happy with this level of indentation. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to do private. Well, what do we need? So what do we get back from this deferred again? We get def.result, which is a game instance, which contains the ID, level name, and the server. We need the parameters, and we need the result. There should be a then that returns a result, and there is. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do private. Let's see. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to do private action on game started. No, I'm going to do private void on game started that takes in a game instance, game parameters. And then here, I'm going to take the destroy internal and I'm going to move it down here to on game started. And then I'm going to go back to using single line lambdas here. So I'm going to say then fiber in queue deferred goes into on game started. We need the instance from then, so we'll accept a parameter of def. We'll pass in def result and then pass in parameters and then break it off like that. So what we accomplished here is, I know it looks a little funky what's going on here, but what we accomplished is reducing the level of indentation. So on our on game started method is its own method here, and we can have our code be a little bit more clean. So again, to read this out loud, what we say is game servers begin game. Then when it's done, we extract the result of what begin game returned. Then we enter a synchronization context. Then we invoke on game started, passing in our result, our game instance, as well as the game parameters that we captured in this closure. So in on game started, we need to establish a connection to the database. So using var database equals new MMO database context, which we might have to pull in some our configuration for the database into our app.config here. So the first thing we want to do is get all the users in game. So I'm going to say var players equals database dot users in game dot, and we'll say where t goes into t game ID equals game.id. And then I'll break this out here, and what do I want to do here? No, I think that's fine. I think that's fine. So I'll do for each var player in players. I'll say, let's see here. We need to get a reference to the player. So remember, we have this hash set of game lobby system players. That's not going to be very helpful here, unfortunately. So it would actually probably be more performant is instead of doing that dot where, I'll do a dot to dictionary. Key goes into key dot player dot ID. V goes into itself. And we'll also go ahead and we'll run an include on t goes into t dot player, so that we in one database query we get all the users in games as well as the player itself, and then we put it into a dictionary. Then I'm going to loop over var player in, and I'm going to do it on our hash set. I'm going to say var player entity equals players at, well, actually I'll do something different here. I'll say user in game player entity. If not players, try get value. Player dot player user, no. Oh, player dot context dot user details dot ID. Out player entity. What do we want to do here? Do we want to throw an exception to nuke the entire game, or do we want to log? So basically what I'm doing is I'm getting all the information from the database, putting it into a dictionary that's indexed. Then I'm looping through all the players that we currently have and trying to match up a player in the lobby with the players that we got from that. And if that doesn't work, I'm just going to throw a new exception. Invalid operation exception. Should never happen. Player context user details ID not found in game.id. So that would crash our program and display it into the logs. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to say player dot proxy dot on game started, passing in our game instance, our parameters, then also passing in our token, which is going to simply be player entity dot token. And I know that the method currently doesn't accept a token yet, but it will here in a moment. But anyway, by doing it like this, we are now informing each player of their individual token, their individual random token that will allow them to authenticate with the region server. So now the next step is to actually go into the onGameStarted method and add that string token to it. So let's hop over here to onGameStarted, and let's add a string authentication token. Now in theory, I should be able to hit F6 and we should get a build. Maybe, hopefully. However, and it worked. However, we do need to add our database connection information to our app.config. So we need to make sure that we're referencing MySQL.conf. Actually, we already are. Oh, we're already making database connection. Awesome. So that means we should now be able to have that running. And let me go ahead and start up our master server and start up one of our game servers. And while that starts up, let's hop back over into our client here. And let's hit F6. This will throw an error. It'll throw an error because we don't have that string parameter on our onGameStarted. So be sure to head over to your assets, code, master server, systems, and this is going to be the game lobby system. And on onGameStarted, we want to do a string authentication token. And then on our context connect to game, we'll also send that authentication token into that. So now let's jump into context connect to game. And let's add in our string authentication token right there. So far so good. And then on our game server.gameserver, remember that's kind of the connection manager here that deals with connecting to a game server and being in a game. We want to go ahead and also add in its constructor our authentication token. Well, let's think about this for a second. So how do we want the authentication token to be sent from the client to the server, or to the region server? I think what we can do here is send it as a part of the init context. So I'm going to do game parameters, and then I'm going to pass an authentication token into the constructor here. And then I'm going to jump into the game server class, add the parameter string authentication token. And when do we do our init context? We do our init context right here on initialize. So I'm going to alias this authentication token out into a private field there, and it's being set right there. And then I'm going to jump down here to our init context, and what I want to do here is I want to pass in what game ID we are and what authentication token we have. So I'm going to pass in byte. So we need an operation parameter. We're going to need an authentication, or let's just do token, and we'll pass in our authentication token. And we'll also do byte operation parameter dot game ID and pass in instance.id. So we need 2 additional members on our operation parameter, enum, token, and game ID. And so we can do that by jumping back over into our base project, opening up the operation parameter structure, and adding token and game ID, and then rebuilding. So hitting F6. So go ahead and wait a second there. Build failed. And we're getting a... I still need to figure that out. Well, restarting Visual Studio seems to fix the issue. I need to come up with a better solution for generating that code. I swear that's what's causing the locking issue. Somehow the code generator is still having a lock on a file or of some sort, or maybe it didn't exit properly. I don't know. Something like that. And we're back. Okay, so let's go ahead and hit F6 again, maybe harder this time. And it should succeed. It seems like it succeeded. So let's hop back over here into our client, and those errors should go away, and they did. Okay. So now we're sending the token and the game ID to the init context of the region server. So now it can authenticate the client immediately when it joins, completely transparent of everything else. So let's hop back over into Buzz MMO, and let's jump into server master and jump into peer, because that's when our init context is being sent here. So if type is player, then we want to extract the game ID and the token. So let's see here. So we're going to need a reference to our game entity service. And with that, we're going to look up the game ID, make sure it's connected to this server. Let's see here. And then verify that the player is indeed a part of the game. So, what am I going to do here? Well, let's go ahead and let's put that logic in our game entity service. So I'm going to say var game entity service equals application container resolve, which is, I'm going to have to pull in that as an extension method, game entity service. And then I want to add a method here for getting the player based off of information. So actually, let's go ahead and extract out the information first. Let's do var game ID equals request at byte operation parameter dot game ID. And of course, we're going to want to cast this into an integer. And then we'll do var token cast a string request byte operation parameter dot token. Then we'll get our game entity service, and then I want to say var player in game equals game entity service dot get player in game. We'll pass in our application dot config dot game server dot unique ID. Do we want to do it this way? Yeah, sure. Pass in the unique ID, the game ID, and the token. And the idea is that it'll return a player in game, or a user in game rather. So then I can check to see if this is null, and if it is, I can reject the connection, disconnect, and say, you know, you sent the wrong token or whatever. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to implement the getPlayerInGame method. It's going to take in a GUID, an integer, and a string. So let's jump over to BuzzMMO data, go into services, go into game entity service, and I'm going to do public user in game, getPlayerInGame, GUID server ID, comma int game ID, comma string token. And then I'm going to say var user in, or just return database dot users in game dot first, or actually I'm going to say var user in game equals database users in game dot first or default, passing in t dot game dot server dot id equals server id, and t game id equals game id. If user in game is null, oops, that doesn't make any sense. There we go. Return null. Then I'm going to validate the token. So I'm going to say if user in game dot token does not equal token, return null. Otherwise, return user in game. All right, so this will make sure that the game is on our server, and let's see, the game is on our server, and the user's token is correct. See, I'm not doing the token comparison inside of the first or default, because the first or default, depending on the coalition you set on the database, which right now I have case insensitive, it'll be a case insensitive comparison. So we want to make sure we validate the token outside of the database query. But this will ensure that the game actually exists in the database, that it's connected to the right server, and it'll also ensure that our token is correct. So now jumping back into peer, we can say if player in game is null, or player in game dot has abandoned, then we want to simply say disconnect and return. We don't want to create a context or anything like that, or return null rather. Which, what happens if we return null anyway? We get an exception. Huh. Well, that's fine. That's fine. I don't care. Okay, so with that, what we should be able to do, now that we have that information, I can say context dot login, passing in a user, and the user is player in game dot player. Player from connected as context dot user details dot username. And there we go. So in theory, this will properly hand everything off. So let's go ahead and hit F6. And I should get a restart. I do have a restart. So now I should be able to jump into Unity. Hold on, it's taking a second to recompile. Come on, you can do it. Come on. There you go. So I should be able to go into, I am in loader. Am I in loader? I am in loader. Hit play. Log in as a user. Create. Hit start. And there was a fatal error. Okay, validation failed for one or more. Ah, I know what's wrong. Remember how I set the IP address to be required, but I didn't set it to anything? I'm just going to say request IP equals blank for now. We'll figure out a different method for establishing the IP address sometime else. But for now, I'll just Just set it to null. Or not null, blank. See, blank is a completely valid value for a not null column in SQL. All right, validation failed. On create game, why did it do that? Did I not set anything else? Has abandoned, I guess, set to false? But it defaults to false. It's a value type. Okay, this is going to be kind of a pain. It's going to be kind of a pain because I need to access the exception details in more detail, which I won't be able to do without a debugger. Let's try this one more time. No. Okay, so just to show you guys, this is the error that I'm getting. So it says validation failed, check entity validation errors for more details, and then it just gives me a stack trace. So it's not giving me anything particularly useful, which is unfortunate. And it's happening on the game server itself, which I won't be able to debug because I'm running it as a service. Let's think here. Well, honestly, users in game, if we look at this, we have required on player, game, has abandoned, hero, team, token, request IP. We set all of those except for the has abandoned, but that's a Boolean, so that doesn't matter. The other thing that we set is request IP and token have a max length of 64 bytes, but we are not using that much. So we could have an issue with game entity itself. So level name server created at, level name server created at is all set. So all of the stuff has been set. Not sure why we're getting that exception there. You know, I could just do something silly here. I'm sure there's a better way to do this. I know there's a better way to do this. DB entity validation exception. We need a log. This feels... No, ilog. Give me ilog. Ilog. Oh, we don't have log4net installed on the BuzzMMO data services. Let's go ahead and do that. The way that I'm going, because I want the log4net version to be the same across the board, I'm going to right-click BuzzMMO, and I'm going to come in here into my Manage NuGet Packages. I'm going to find log4net, wherever you are. Oh, right. We're using the, never mind. We're using the Photon log4net. So I'm going to right-click References, Add Reference, Browse, and I'm going to make sure we're in the right folder, and I'm going to grab this log4net and hit OK. Okay, so now we have log4net installed. So private static read-only ilog log equals log manager get logger type of game entity service. And then down here, I'm going to say log dot error, and we have entity validation errors. So how about just error string join entity entity validation errors dot select, t goes into t dot, oh come on, you gotta be kidding me, string dot join comma on t dot validation errors dot select, t goes into t dot, let's do a this, well, t2 dot property name colon t2 dot error message. Okay, so there we go. And I'm just going to log it out. I'm not going to eat the exception. I'm going to let the, well, whoops. There we go. I'm not going to eat the exception. I'm just going to rethrow it there. Okay, so build succeeded. Now we can get some more information. That's really nasty. You know what? I could probably, I'm thinking about this. I'm sure there's a feature in log4net for installing something like an exception filter, which allows me to catch specific exception types and provide custom formatting, which is something that would be interesting to look into. But right now this video is kind of running a little bit longer than I expected it to, so we're just going to see what happens here. All right, there was a fatal error. Request IP field is required. It was the request IP field. Okay, so that is a discrepancy between the data annotations required attribute and the limitations on MySQL Server itself, or SQL servers in general. It looks like an empty string triggers the required validation to fail. Let's see if a string with a space in it triggers that to fail as well. I should have just left that out. If I'm not even using it. Nope, empty string still doesn't want an empty string. So what we're going to do here is we're just going to do 127001. There we go. All right, are you happy now? Finally. And it is happy. Okay, so there we go. Right there, it all worked. Player from 127001 connected as admin. And that's what we wanted. So now, on the game server itself, we now know which player is which without having to relog in or anything like that. It's all handled behind the scenes. So if we look at, for example, our database right here, and open up user and games, we see that we now have a token being created that allows us to authenticate ourselves. And I can go ahead and restart this and log in as Nelson instead, create the lobby, and as you see right here, we get connected as Nelson. So now we have a fairly secure method of authenticating players for which games they are joining. Awesome. So with that, I think that wraps up this video. In the next video, we're going to talk more about the handoff. We're going to go through different scenarios, such as abandoning or disconnecting from a game or a game server going down or something like that. We need to handle all those edge cases and to make things more reliable. So with that, we'll see you guys in the next video.